And once again, let me officially welcome everyone to today's online event, Transparency, Frontiers and Failures. Today's event is sponsored by the Transparency Policy Project and the Government Innovators Network at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I'd like to start things off, as we often do, with a poll. As I mentioned, today's audience is pretty diverse, and that includes geography. And we wanted to get a sense right off the bat of where everybody is coming from. So if you would just click on the option in front of you that is most appropriate, you should see the results tabulating. And we have a couple other poll questions for you today, and our panel will be administering those questions periodically throughout the event. So whenever you see a polling slide appear in front of you, you don't have to wait for a cue. You can just click on the option that best represents you. And without further ado, let me just introduce our panel today. Our panel is, they are the co-directors of the Transparency Policy Project and also authors of the book Full Disclosure, Promise and Perils of Transparency. We have Archon Fung, who is a professor of public policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Mary Graham is a research fellow at the Taubman Center for State and Local Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. And David Weil is a professor of economics and the Everett W. Lord Distinguished Faculty Scholar at the Boston University School of Management. So, if you would, Archon, why don't you start us off?
Great. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time today to log in. This is a kind of web presentation for our group, so we very much look forward to not just the discussion, but the experience of doing this and connecting with you all through this technology that makes it all possible. Since we'd like to maximize the time for exchange and questions and answers, we've decided to sort of have only a short kind of introduction that I'll do. Usually when we do this in a longer face-to-face format, each of the three of us takes responsibility for part of the presentation, but we want to really maximize the time for exchange here. So, so I'll do the introduction, and then my colleagues and co-authors, co-conspirators, Mary and David, will jump in shortly after that. Now, the subject of today's talk today's discussion is transparency, and that word means a lot of things to a lot of different people. We saw from the registration sheet that it seems that a lot of you work on transparency from the right-to-know perspective. That is, transparency is the information that's provided to citizens by government as a matter of right, as part of making the democratic process work. That's one kind of transparency, and we'll be talking about that and then also several others. We feel that the insights, to the extent that we have insights on transparency that we've developed, apply to the broad range of the phenomenon, and we look forward to engaging with you about whether they do or not. Now, most of what I'll be presenting today comes from a book that Mary, David, and I did. We've been writing this book for about 2 or 3 years, and it came out just a few months ago from Cambridge University Press, the title of which is Full Disclosure. And Full Disclosure examines a range of what we call targeted transparency policies. And targeted transparency policies are laws that require actors, usually private corporations, but sometimes government entities like schools or hospitals, when they're public hospitals, to disclose information to the public that they wouldn't otherwise disclose. And then the thought is that when that information gets out, it will help actors in the public advance some public good that government and citizens care about, like product safety or clean water or healthier food or better schools. And so the question of the book is, does disclosure policy ever do that? And if it does, what are the conditions under which that happens? And so just a few examples. But before I get to that, maybe we ought to have a little bit of, ask you a couple of questions to get a sense of where people in the room are. So the first question is, what is the sector in which you work? Because transparency will take on different meanings and create different roles for you depending on where you work. Just give this about 30 more seconds. Oh, it's interesting. So most people in the audience come from state, provincial, or local governments. The next largest category is actually the business and private sector, some from federal government, some from civil society or nonprofit groups, although that went up and went back down. Not sure what that means exactly. But so an array of people from different sectors here. And then now, the next question has to do with your initial knee-jerk take on transparency, whatever that word means to you. So I've talked a little bit about transparency and information disclosure in public policy. What do you think is the most important aspect of transparency? As a basic component of democracy, information to improve public performance or private performance, providing information to the public so that they can make more informed choices about daily decisions, provide information to the public to reduce the chance of corruption, to hold governments or corporations or other entities accountable, as it were, or to provide a mechanism to allow the public to give and receive criticism about products, services, and organizations. So it looks like we get a distribution there. The first kind of answer, that information should be provided to the public as a basic component of democracy, is the classic right-to-know justification. Providing information to improve performance and reduce risks is the subject of many, or the ambition and goal of many of the cases that we've looked at. And then providing information to reduce corruption is an important goal. We looked a little bit at that at full disclosure, but we'd be very interested in hearing what people in the audience think are the most important examples of that and experiences in public policy so far. All right. So now, here are just a few examples of the transparency policies, the targeted transparency systems that we looked at and that inform how we think about transparency. The first is nutritional labels. So for those of you who live in the United States or Europe, as well as many other countries, but we know for sure the United States and Europe, anytime you buy a package of food at the grocery store, you'll see on that food a label that describes usually the contents and then sometimes, and then often the various dimensions of nutritional value. And the goal of this law, this disclosure requirement, is to compel manufacturers to provide information to the food-consuming public, which I suppose is all of us, so that people who consume food and make these purchasing choices can buy food that's better for them, so ultimately to improve public health. And here is the label as it appears on U.S. food packaging. And then here is a label that many people think is a little bit more user-friendly that appears on food that is sold at Sainsbury's in the UK, just as an example. Another example comes from the world of automobiles and car crash testing and car purchasing in the United States. In the United States, all new car models are required to have rollover ratings that are produced by government testers, and then depending on how likely an automobile is to roll over, it's assigned a star rating. And so the more stars a particular car model has on it, the less likely it is to roll over. And the star system was introduced as a way to make relatively complex information, that is the probability that a car will roll over in the case of in the event that the driver loses control, more accessible and more understandable. Now, another transparency system was created after the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Centers. And this is the color-coded Homeland Security Advisory System. The Department of Homeland Security assigns a color in any given period that is supposed to estimate how much threat the population faces from terrorist attack. We consider for reasons that we'll discuss in a moment, we consider the Homeland Security Advisory System not very effective system of disclosure and information provision. And in the book, we contrast it with a system that we consider highly effective, which is the restaurant rating system in Los Angeles County. I don't know how many people in the audience have been to Los Angeles recently, but if you have, and you go to Los Angeles and you eat out at a restaurant, you'll notice that whenever you go through the front door of the restaurant, you'll see a letter grade, A, B, or C, posted very publicly, and that letter grade reflects the health and hygiene inspection rating for that restaurant, the last health and hygiene inspection rating. And A is for the cleanest kinds of kitchens, and C is for the worst kinds. And this system has proven very effective in both reducing incidences of food poisoning from eating out at restaurants and subsequent hospitalization, and then also improved the cleanliness of kitchens as determined by subsequent health inspections. And the reasons for this are fairly straightforward. It's very easy for people who go to restaurants to avoid one low rating and go to a different restaurant that has a better health and safety rating. And so it creates strong incentives for people who run restaurants to get their act together with respect to how clean their kitchens are. Now here is the federal law requires public drinking water systems to create a report card that shows the levels and ranges of a bunch of different contaminants in public water systems. And people receive this report card. You probably received one if you live in the United States periodically. And this is another example of information disclosure. In our view, this is an extremely poor example for several reasons. Compare it to, for instance, the rollover rating system. This is a star system that is very easy to interpret. It's easy to compare different choices. You know that if you're considering a 2007 Ford Explorer, it's less likely to roll over than a 2007 Cadillac Escalade, because the Explorer has 4 stars and the Escalade has 7 stars. So you can make a reasonable choice. Even if you decide to choose the Escalade, you're doing so with relatively full information. By contrast, safe drinking water report cards are very difficult to interpret, both with regard to the question. They're hard to interpret. You don't know how much danger you actually face from these contaminants, and then hard to make choices based on that information. For instance, should you move to a different town? Should you opt to buy a filter to put on your tap? Should you avoid public water altogether and just drink bottled water? Those are the relevant choices, but this kind of report card doesn't really help anyone make those choices in a more reasonable and well-informed way. Here is the fuller list of transparency systems that we examined. We looked at corporate financial disclosure, that is the Securities and Exchange System, that has been around since 1933 but evolved in various ways. We looked at requirements on labor unions to disclose their finances to their members and to the public. Campaign finance disclosure, which you've heard a lot about in the primaries, who's getting money from whom, and also how they're spending it. Mortgage lending reports, toxics release notification in the environmental arena, nutritional labeling, hospitals, and many others there. Now, what this vast array of transparency systems have in common, and this is only a sampling of the disclosure and targeted transparency systems that exist, but they all have in common 5 or 6 features. And here is our definition of targeted transparency policies. Now, such policies mandate disclosure by corporations or other actors of new, that is information that's not already in the public domain, standardized, comparable, and disaggregated information regarding specific products or practices to a broad audience. There are many information requirements that require actors to give information and report just to the government, but that's obviously not what we're talking about. We're talking about information that's, in principle, designed and accessible to the broad audience of the full public. And then the last one is important. In our view, targeted transparency policies, not in our view, by definition, targeted transparency policies all have a regulatory purpose. The auto rollover system that I described is aimed to improve the safety of cars, safe drinking water. Reporting is designed to increase the safety of drinking water, and so on. Now, well, before I get to that, let me ask a couple of questions here. So, let me ask some questions about the systems that we've just talked about. Now, I just mentioned the nutritional label system. How many of you use it and estimate what frequency, roughly? So it looks like, now this is not a randomly selected audience, obviously. People who decided to participate in this event are probably more in tune with information than the general public. But nevertheless, a lot of people use this information, it looks like. An overwhelming percentage of the audience uses it at least sometimes. Now, what about the federal drinking water reports that you probably, if you live in the United States, you all get mailed periodically? Do you use that? So about a quarter of the audience uses it sometimes, which I bet is much, much higher than the public at large. Well, good for you. And then here's a transparency system that is not federally mandated. How many of you use the daily weather report in your local newspaper or web to make choices in your day? So much higher even than nutritional labeling. And this is instructive. This is kind of a little bit of a humorous example, but it's instructive because as policymakers or people studying policy or people who are regulated by it, we want to use the most successful examples that are available to us to inform how to do policy. And with regard to transparency, weather reports are extremely useful because they provide information in a timely fashion that is important to organizing people's lives. And we want to make more transparency policies like weather reports so that, if this particular poll is any reflection of broader trends, 85% of people use it often at least, and then almost all of you, not almost, all of you use it at least sometimes. And then how about that subject of late night comedians' humor, the Homeland Security transparency system? Do you use the Homeland Security Advisory System regarding threats? And do you know what color the alert status of the day is? No. So almost nobody uses it, and you don't use it not because you think that danger from attack is not important thing to think about, but because the Homeland Security System, that particular system of information disclosure, doesn't help you make any choices about how to deal with that threat. Okay. So now, I'm about to wrap up here, but part of the effort of the book is to help people understand and help us understand why transparency policies work, why some of them work and advance their regulatory goals while some do not. And we've developed a concept of embeddedness to explain why some transparency policies are effective while others are not. And the idea is that transparency policies are effective only when, or just in case, they provide information that becomes embedded in the routines of people who are the intended audience for that information. So think about the weather report. The weather report is embedded in many of your everyday routines about how to get to work, maybe what to wear, what to bring to work, right? You get up in the morning and maybe you log into the Yahoo or New York Times web page, or you turn on the television or read the newspaper, or maybe turn on the Weather Channel. And the information is right there. You know how to get it. You're used to getting it, and you're used to responding to it in a timely way. And similarly, although not to the same extent, the information provided by nutritional labels has become like that. It's provided in a way that is very accessible to people, and many shoppers have become very accustomed to using that information as they do a weather report to make choices that are meaningful to them. Many people care about eating healthy food and at least avoiding food that contains stuff maybe that they're allergic to or that exacerbates conditions that they have. And they're accustomed to integrating this information into their choices in a timely and easy way. Now, take in contrast two systems. The Homeland Security System. Ask yourself, is that information about an issue that's important to you? Well, yes, it is. The issue of terrorist attack is quite important to many people, but the information is not provided in a way that helps people guide choices in their lives. And so therefore, there's very low uptake. That information has not become embedded in the everyday routines that people have, and hence 90% of you say, no, you don't use the Homeland Security Threat Advisory System. Similarly, with drinking water contamination, most of you said that you did not use that information even though it's provided to you. It's not because it's inaccessible in the sense that you can't get to it, but it is difficult to comprehend and interpret what is in that report, right? So it doesn't really affect your perception, and it doesn't really change your most of people's behavior in a meaningful way. You know, whether you're if you buy bottled water, maybe you shouldn't be. Maybe you should just be drinking tap water. If you're drinking tap water, maybe you should be buying bottled water, depending on where you live. For most people, the safe drinking water reports are not helping them make that decision because the information is too difficult to interpret. So our thought is that information, in order to become embedded in the routines of people in the intended audience of a disclosure system, the information has to be valuable to choices that they make. It has to be comprehensible to them, as the safe drinking water information is not. And then it has to be compatible with the ways that they gather information in their everyday lives. So, you know, weather reports and nutritional labeling and the LA restaurant report cards, information is provided in a way that's very compatible with people's day-to-day routines. Some other information systems provide information that in ways that is not very compatible at all. And then I'll kind of skip over the effectiveness discussion, but we can get to that in the question and answer a little bit. But the basic thought there is that it's not only the audience that has to be mobilized by information for a transparency system to be effective, but the disclosures of information, people who make cars, for instance, or people who run restaurants, people who operate water utilities, etc., have to be in tune with the actions and responses of consumers or citizens or investors, and they aren't always in tune in that way. Now, people often think that information and transparency and disclosure are always good, no matter what the problem is. We don't quite hold that view. We think that only certain kinds of problems are appropriate for disclosure and transparency as a public policy measure, and these are some features of problems for which information and transparency is a good candidate for public policy. So areas in which there are consensus metrics. This is important. So think about school report cards and standardized testing, and there's a big debate over that, in part because people don't really agree on what constitutes a good school. Certainly good tests measure something that's important to people, but they also miss a lot as well. And so part of the reason school report cards have a little less uptake and are a little less useful than they might otherwise be is because there's dissensus regarding the underlying metrics in the education area. Second, communication has to be practical. There are some areas of public policy in which it's difficult to communicate the relevant information. Third, users have the will and capacity to improve their choices in some area. So nutritional labels don't work for everybody. Some people misuse the information and choose foods that are actually not good for them in a public health sense, but sort of to lose weight beyond when that's a reasonable thing to do, etc. A fourth condition is that the people who have disclosed the information and the organizations that disclose information have the capacity to improve their performance. They might not always be able to do so. And then finally, and this may be one of the most important conditions, you want to use transparency as a public policy measure when variable results are acceptable. So there are some areas in life, like maybe lead on in paint on children's toys and mercury in the environment, for which variable results are not acceptable. And we don't want transparency policies. We just want a straight-out, conventional, kind of top-down command and control ban, whereas in other areas, variable results are acceptable. People might have kind of different tastes for safety in cars, for instance, and as a public policy judgment, it might be fine that people buy some cars that are more likely to roll over than others, so long as they're not too likely to roll over. And then here is a couple. Let me just wrap up with a couple of points about where some work on transparency, both in terms of research and public policy, might be going. Right now, an extremely rich area for potential disclosure, and I know that there's a lot of work going on this on this issue in the United Kingdom and in the United States as well, is in healthcare provision. And the Department of Health and Human Services is developing a template and a set of procedures for disclosing hospital quality. And here, notice this is a snapshot of some dimensions of their template. And I want to draw your attention to two columns here. The first column is labeled quality right here. And that's a star system, just like the auto rollover system. And here, the quality measure is determined by expert ratings. That is, audits of hospitals based on statistics that they report and probably some on-spot audits, etc. Right? So professional judgments about what constitutes a good hospital. But then that information is also put adjacent to quite a different measure, which is the patient assessment of care. And as you can see from the sample here, excuse me, these two dimensions don't always correlate, although sometimes they're pretty close. So patients can sometimes judge a hospital to be better or worse than experts are, than expert judgment. Who's right about that? Well, the truth may lie on both dimensions, and the thought here is that patients and clients of hospitals should have both sets of information to make judgments that they care about. Our research is probably going to turn in the future on a quite different set of transparency policy, or not really policies, but transparency dynamics which involve the provision of information not by reporting or by government, as I've just discussed, but by users and kind of clients themselves. That is the horizontal provision of information. And probably all of you are familiar with this kind of thing in the private sector. So if you buy books off Amazon, you may read the user or reader reviews of books that you're considering. Or if you buy things on eBay, you may consult eBay seller ratings, etc. All of those ratings are compiled by, not by experts, but by people just like you who are who have purchased purchased a product or used a service and had that experience and have something to say about it. Technology is now making possible the reporting and collection and dissemination of that horizontal information on a very massive scale. Its application of the public sector is, we think, kind of lagging behind the private sector, but we think that there's a large potential for application there. And here's kind of one NGO civil society example drawn from the public health arena. This is whoissick.org, and this site hasn't really taken off quite yet. But you can imagine what it would be kind of in the future if it had many, many participants. Here you can log on to Who is Sick if you're not feeling well. I have a little bit of a sore throat today. You can log on and report your location and then report the condition that you have. And in this very decentralized way, it might eventually become possible for people to decide where they want to avoid visiting in a particular week to keep from getting sick, or for public health professionals, it may make it easier eventually for them to identify the pathways and trajectories of various kinds of diseases. And so that's where some of the work is going in the future. And why don't we kind of wrap it up there and open it up to a broader discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, this is Mary Graham. We're beginning to get some good questions. And I thought I would start off with one from Joe Coletti, who works for a foundation in North Carolina. Joe's asking about how state and local governments can make their activities more transparent in a consistent way, and how regulations and budgets can be made more transparent across boundaries. This is a really good question for those of you, and there are a lot of you who work for state and local governments or for the federal government, because one of the things that our research reveals is that comparability, having metrics, whatever your form of measurement is that applies to your particular area, having metrics that are consistent and can be compared across state boundaries, across cities and towns, internationally in some cases, is critical to the success of transparency. I think many of us in the United States have assumed that just getting information out there is a good thing, and often it is a good thing, but when the object is to make government perform better, for example, it's very important to have the metrics specifically geared to the goal and to have the metrics comparable. So let's just take a couple of examples. School report cards and water reports we've already mentioned. We have to think of it from the point of view of somebody who's moving in to a metropolitan area that might include two states. There's some in the United States, like the Washington, D.C. area, that include 3 states or one district and 2 states. And so people who are choosing neighborhoods to live in often would want to know where's the water healthiest and where are the schools best. And so these consistent metrics are very important. Likewise, budget information. It's not much use if you can't say whether the budget of one city is doing better than another, or one town's doing better than another, or has particular strengths and weaknesses. And the only thing I would say, Joe, in addition to these general remarks, and you may want to follow up, is that private organizations often play a role in helping to develop consistent metrics. So these things don't usually spring full-blown into perfect shape at the beginning. Intermediary organizations like foundations or associations of mayors and governors or state legislators may be able to start forming metrics that can become gradually adopted by everybody. So we're beginning to see that in the area of global warming. I don't know how many of you are concerned with how states are doing and cities are doing in responding to the threats of global warming by trying to control carbon emissions. But we've seen these metrics for carbon emissions, which are not simple, developed over the years by private organizations first, and then generally adopted locally, nationally, and now internationally. It's not to say that they're perfect now, but just to say that they're good enough to support cap-and-trade markets and other mechanisms to get comparable results for how cities, towns, countries, factories are doing in controlling their carbon emissions. So let's go to the next question, and I think David Weil's going to take the next one.
Yeah, Mary Nix has asked a question about the slide that Archon showed about the HHS, the Health and Human Service template for reporting healthcare quality and outcomes. And Mary's question was, is that actually out there as a live system, or is it a template? And the answer is, it is a template. It's sort of the goal of HHS in creating a healthcare transparency system. What's interesting about it, let me just put that slide up so you can all see. Let's see. Where are we? Okay. Okay. All right. Sorry. What's interesting about this template is, as Archon described, it potentially provides all the kinds of information, at least at a very top level, that someone might want about patient quality, about or the quality of outcomes, as well as patients' own past quality of service and the cost of activity. But it is just a template and its sort of goal, and I think it illustrates several of the issues that have already been discussed, and also some of the political kinds of questions behind transparency policies we haven't yet raised. One of the reasons that this kind of template is not currently available has to do with the complexities of creating metrics, agreed upon metrics about something like patient quality or quality outcomes. And as you can imagine, this is controversial for really two kinds of reasons. One is there's, of course, substantive disagreements about what is a good measure of efficiency or quality of outcomes, effectiveness of outcomes in the healthcare area, as would be the case in any number of areas. And people have reasonably different kinds of opinions about that. In addition to that, there is a political dimension in transparency policies, as there is in any regulatory policy. And that is, there are different institutions who have stakes and interests in supporting different kinds of measures, and that has created difficulties in coming up with consensus measures of something like quality or other health outcomes in creating this system. That being said, there has been a lot of progress. The area of healthcare disclosure really came to a head in the 1990s with the Institute of Medicine report about the high number of medical errors in many healthcare institutions in the country. And that raised the issue, going back to the Clinton administration, of creating a transparency system to allow potential patients and consumers of healthcare information about different medical error rates. The reality is the politics made it very difficult to achieve a consensus about what those measures were. If you fast forward from the late Clinton administration to today, you do have now a Health and Human Service system that provides information about a limited number of healthcare outcomes that HHS discloses and allows people to look at different hospitals and rate different hospitals on those outcomes. But that being said, it's actually a relatively limited set of outcomes at this point in time that patients and other healthcare consumers have access through that site, again, because of some of the difficulties of creating comparable measures that I mentioned. Also, just getting back to Mary's initial question of what is available and what isn't, there soon will be, in the third week of March, is at least the tentative launch date, public access to what healthcare institutions have been required or have been collecting for a long period of time, and that are randomly surveyed patients' quality measures of the healthcare services they've been provided. While that information has been collected for more than a decade, in late March on the Health and Human Service website, consumers will be able to get access to that information and find out and compare the quality measured in a variety of ways of different healthcare institutions. But again, one of the difficulties in coming up with that system has been about coming to a consensus about what are the appropriate measures to be released.
This is Mary Graham again. While we're waiting for more questions, I thought I might just say a little bit about the evolution of right to know, since so many of you are concerned about government accountability. You know, in the 60s and the 70s in the United States, and many all states also, in addition to the federal government in the United States, now have right to know laws. And as many of you know, and you're working in this area, many other countries do as well. There was sort of an assumption that right to know was an easy thing, and that information would be easily provided. It should be provided to the public unless there was some good reason not to, and that it would be kind of an automatic thing. We have found out in the United States and in the States that is not true. Right to know is exceedingly difficult to implement in a way that makes information truly accessible to people and that fosters the goal of government accountability. So and I think we're seeing an evolution from thinking of public access to information as simply putting information in the public domain, getting it out of the government file, putting it, saying people can have access to it in a reading room, saying more recently that people can have access to most information on the web, but leaving it in complicated databases or in whatever form it's been originally. So that's the traditional idea. But where we're going toward, I think, is an idea that access really has to be user-oriented. So the members of the public, for most members of the public, a complicated database is not very useful. And the question that I think increasingly faces all of us and people in government is, to what extent does government have an obligation to make that information truly understandable to most people and to put it in a place, in a time, in a format that is where it can be used by people either to demand change of government or to compare governments, to know more about what's going on in their neighborhoods in terms of toxic chemicals, and so on. So I think when we think of right to know, I would encourage all of us to think of it as a dynamic process, something where, now that we're in what we call the information age, and there's tremendous capacity to empower ordinary citizens with information that the government holds, that we have a higher standard for what we consider true public access to information. And it means that people in government need to think in advance about what audience, what they're really trying to accomplish, Legislators need to think about that when they're passing these laws. What information makes sense? What kind of format should it be in? And what kind of analysis and feedback can you develop so that you are sure that right to know gets better over time instead of less effective? In full disclosure, the book that we published last year and the paperback of which is going to come out this summer and will be a more reasonable price, under $20. We tried to say that the dynamics are really important. If nobody's watching, even a good legislated disclosure system that says a right-to-know system that's pretty clear will deteriorate over time. So the question of having public groups, groups of citizens or government analysis that monitors over time how right-to-know is working in whatever domain each of you is operating right now is extremely important. For those of you in countries that have new right-to-know laws, it's important, I think, to realize that transparency is culturally specific, that the way it works, and Archon showed you our slide of what we think of as the action cycle, is quite complicated, and the capacity of your various audiences of citizens and consumers to be able to receive and understand information, to make choices, and in turn to have the government agencies improve their practices because they've seen that there's a public demand to operate differently, is each of those questions has to be very specific to the language capabilities, the educational capabilities, and the cultural traditions of the people that you're trying to reach. So let me turn it back over to David and Archon.
We have a question from Luis Moreira. Shouldn't it be the government's responsibility to not just provide the information in a passive manner via obscure links on web portals, but to proactively give information to relevant groups and individuals in society and citizens in general? For instance, providing reforms in land use to environmental groups or activists. And we entirely agree with that point. In fact, and again, getting back to some of the examples that I think both Mary and Archon have provided, it's not, in our view, full disclosure to provide information on obscure websites. In fact, quite the opposite, that simply providing information out there in ways that users can't see or don't, or even where they know about it can't be used in a useful manner, can have quite the opposite effect, because on one hand, the government can claim that actions have been taken to redress a problem through transparency, but if that information is not in a usable kind of format, our studies show that it's going to have very limited, if any, impact on the outcomes of concern, and as a result, you're potentially worse off than in a situation where you haven't dealt with it, because on one hand, you've created a policy to address the problem, and yet in the reality as little has been done to really change things. Now there are several different mechanisms, however, and roles of civic organizations, third-party organizations in the transparency policy process that can be very useful. And you cited the case in your question of environmental reform. In fact, in the United States, one of the policies we've studied in great deal is something called the Toxics Reporting Inventory, which requires major manufacturers to provide quarterly information about pollution effluents to the public, pollution exposures to the public. Well, one of the reasons that very technical information has in fact had a very powerful impact on the public is the role of third-party organizations in translating very complicated information on pollution exposures into much more usable formats, and through the creation, in particular, of something called Scorecard, which is a web-based application that allows one to translate this complicated information on pollution emissions to specific information about the amount of pollution emissions in a particular zip code area, in a specific geographic area, in this case in the United States. And so there you have a very important role in translating what might otherwise be obscure data into very useful data for the public via this important role played by, in this case, environmental not-for-profit organizations. And we see many examples of that. I think one of the most powerful examples we're all currently in the midst of is in the political realm, where third-party organizations have taken, in a real-time basis, information about campaign contributions in our presidential elections and made it accessible to the public, principally through the third-party mechanism of news organizations, which have taken what is now real-time, very current information on campaign contributions and made that accessible to the public through the ongoing analysis of that information as it comes in from our Federal Election Commission and providing it to the public. So going back to your question, while we certainly agree that arcane sources of information through obscure websites is not the answer, in fact it's one of the failures of transparency, where there are these third-party organizations, there's additional ways to make transparency policies far more vibrant and effective.
Yeah, maybe I just add a little bit onto that, which is that there's a couple of different things that third-party, nonprofit, or civil society organizations do in this arena. One of which David talked a lot about, is interpreting the information and making it more accessible to people. So providing better web portals, or even addressing the audiences and organizations that are most interested directly. Another way, however, is by pressing through political channels to make sure that government does provide the right kinds of information and does so in an accessible way. So one of the most prominent and successful examples of this is the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in the United States, which compels banks to disclose the demographics of who they loan money to in home loans. And this measure was conceived originally as a tool to document the racial discrimination in urban lending and redlining problems. And it was kind of supported by a bunch of community organizations who lobbied hard for it. And then they got a weak form of the law in. They got some information, and they used that information to sue some banks and then work with federal regulators and other kinds of bank regulators to push banks to discriminate less, to eliminate discrimination. And then so there was kind of a virtuous cycle between the political objectives of these community organizations and the information that was provided through the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. And those kinds of third parties then had a much stronger incentive to mobilize and make sure that the information law stayed on the books and indeed got stronger over time. And so it's not just government's responsibility, it is government's responsibility to provide information in a more active and accessible manner, as you say, but government oftentimes won't act on that responsibility unless it has some political reasons to do so. That is, unless some people on the outside are pressing for the right kinds of disclosure regulations.
Thanks, Archon. This is Mary Graham again. We have a really interesting and good question from Al Vogel. Al, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, who's a town manager in Colchester, Vermont. And he's raised the question of what we might call thoughtless disclosure by governments, where government discloses information that includes personal information such as social security numbers or birth dates that clash with our important ideas of personal privacy. And he's asking whether anybody's really has been thinking about the costs of transparency and the costs of redacting that information to a town government, for example. So let me just say two things. One is that transparency often does conflict with other enduring values that we all care about. It conflicts with personal privacy at times. It conflicts with protecting trade secrets for corporations. It sometimes conflicts with national security. So we need to get used to the idea that we're balancing the need for transparency against, at times, against the need to protect other values. Here again, we're giving up our idea that transparency is always an absolute value and that it's always beneficial, and we're looking at it situation by situation to talk about its benefits, which can be very important. So on the cost question, there's been a great deal of attention, and we've talked about some of this in our book. There's been a great deal of attention at the federal level to the very great cost of implementing the Freedom of Information Act. And some of that, a good deal of that, has to do with the redacting issue. I have not seen, and maybe Archon and David can help, any discussion of excuse me, the costs at the state and local level.
Okay, we have a question from Tim Burke from the Ash Institute. What are the trends or any successful examples of making information on public primary, secondary school performance available to parents? And is there any relation to the No Child Left Behind Act and the implication of who decides what the most important indicators are of those kinds of questions? There are, the overall answer I would provide to that question is there are lots of potential sources of information about schools and school quality available to parents. In fact, in lunch when we were preparing for our talk today, we were discussing exactly this problem about where does someone who's trying to make particularly a location decision where you have children going into the public school system, where do you go to get that information? And I think it illustrates another of the complexities of transparency policy. Again, one of both the promise and some of the pitfalls of transparency. The good news is there is a lot of information out there, some of it provided by state governments, usually built around test results. In Massachusetts, we have something called the MCAS tests, which are standardized tests that are administered at every grade level now for students in the Massachusetts public school system. And of course, all of you in different parts of the United States probably know of the comparable system in your own state. Many of the transparency systems provide that specific information to parents. And that obviously can be very helpful in at least making one kind of assessment. The problem is, first of all, even for that kind of data, that data tends to be very skewed by the social economic status of the community where schools reside. And so if one is trying to get a comparable sense of the quality of schools, the quality of outcomes, you have to be very careful. And usually those systems don't provide the kind of information about the nature of the school itself that one can use to think about what those test scores measures actually mean. In particular, the important characteristic of the diversity of the student base in thinking about those results. A second problem is very few parents want to make the choice simply on the basis of test scores. There are a whole other range of qualities of the inputs of schools, the nature of the teachers, the nature of the classroom environment, class size, the philosophy of the school, the location of the school, the access to other programs beyond the core educational content, art programs, physical education, and so on, that make the kinds of information parents want often very different than the kind of information they can actually get. In his opening remarks, Archon talked about sort of the frontier of transparency that we see as, again, offering a lot of opportunities but also pitfalls in the future, and that is a transparency that allows much more engagement by users in actually providing information about outcomes. In the school case, obviously one of the most important sources of information about the quality of schools are the experiences of parents and students in those school systems. So there's an enormous possibility of giving people access to information from other parents, other families, other schools, other children, and teachers as well, about different schools and allowing people to make the choice. That's the opportunity. The problem is, and it gets back to the whole idea of standardized ways of comparing schools, until you have a critical mass of people reporting that kind of information and in a form that a potential parent choosing between two locations can actually look at, there are real limitations in how much information of that source are going to be available. So I think our evaluation is that schools, reporting of school quality and outcomes certainly represents one of the real promising areas of much more enhanced transparency. But I think at this stage it's only gone a very small distance towards what a system like that could become.
Okay, here's a question from Charles Betley. Charles works in the healthcare field in Pennsylvania, and he's asked a good question, which is, in situations where there are not yet common metrics, how do those metrics evolve and come into being? There's several patterns, and again, you've hit the important point, which is there is evolution. So often there are not common metrics in the beginning when there's an interest in disclosure of healthcare cost and quality. For example, in the healthcare area, it kind of operated in two directions, from the top down and from the bottom up. So from the top down, the agency, which has changed names a couple of times, which oversees the Medicare and Medicaid programs, the federal government being the largest purchaser of health care by far in the United States. That agency is now called CMS, at least the acronym CMS. That agency has taken a proactive role in trying to develop, with a broad group of experts around the country, a set of common metrics. And it looks to me, I'm not a healthcare expert, as if it's been a remarkably successful effort. So that's the top-down part of it. At the same time, corporations and insurance companies, who are always also very concerned with healthcare costs, have also worked on common metrics. And what we're seeing, and you don't always see this, and it's a good question to ask in your particular situation, what we're seeing is, I think, is a convergence of those metrics to a pretty close to a consensus. And if you go to the if you go to the HHS website, you'll find references to the development of those metrics, what they are, and how they are converging, and the plans to put them into broader use. So I hope that helps, Charles.
Just we have the site that Mary mentioned up on the screen right now, and just to give you a sense of how it works at this point, and the measures that are currently available. This is the main site that anyone can get access to on HHS about health outcomes. And I'll just give you an example. Let's say I wanted to find what the performance was. Let's say I needed some kind of heart procedure and I was living in, I will pick my home turf in northeastern Colorado. You can see on the site a way of logging in for a specific zip code. I'll just put in a zip code there and a distance around that area. So let's say I wanted information about the kinds of things Marion was just saying. The site allows me to first decide which of the hospitals available to me there I want access to, and then what kind of procedure I want this kind of specific data about. Let's say it's about heart failure quality, and I select, I want all the measures available to me about how different hospitals in this area perform. Well, this site gives you 5 different metrics of the performance of hospitals. Overall, all the hospitals in the United States along those dimensions, average performance of Colorado hospitals, and then the specific hospitals I have to choose from. And you can see that on the measures I have at hand, I have some variability in terms of the outcomes that I might want to use to choose. The real question becomes, what's the utility of the information I'm being given to make those choices? So, for example, this first chart is giving you information about the percent of heart failure patients given a specific type of ACE inhibitor for a certain kind of heart function measure. In this particular area, the hospital that's right in the middle of the zip code I picked, North Colorado Medical Center, has the highest percentage of provision of that ACE inhibitor of any of the comparable groups. Well, maybe that's good news in terms of making my choice. On the other hand, if what I'm looking at is a different kind of measure, I'm not going to get most of the measures you can see in this particular screen are about inputs or activities the hospital provides. They're not about health outcomes. If I'm looking at health outcomes for specific procedures, or I want to know the number of, let's say, of heart surgeries performed of a certain type, I'm not going to get it from this kind of information base. If I want to know things about the patient experience with the quality of care, as I responded to an earlier question from another participant, that's information you can't currently get, but in another month, this particular site we're looking at now will be augmented to provide that. So there's a lot of, as in the case of educational outcomes, there's a lot of movement in the healthcare area, but there's a long way to go before we have the kind of information that we would regard as really helpful for making the very difficult choices people typically need to make in the healthcare area.
Great. Thanks, David. This is Archon. I'm going to field a question from John Garfunkel at Pegasystems from Cambridge, Massachusetts, who's a software engineer. So welcome question. He says that this discussion is partially a question about search engine optimization. So you search in your favorite engine for company X, and you want a third-party auditing service to show up pretty high on the list. And then he says, Wikipedia sometimes is surprisingly good about pointing out disclosed problems with company X, but it's not guaranteed. Google has started being necessarily transparent when people search for a drug name, but will they do it for business names? Not saying they can't or they won't, but the fact remains that understanding what Google may or may not do is critical to almost any public information question. And this touches on an important issue that our research kind of leaves off. And hopefully our research and the investigations of others in information policy will turn to this question later. Now, most of the systems that we've looked at are run by governments, and so there's a whole process there of how their search engines are optimized that's partially about kind of technical questions about what auto experts or doctors or medical experts think is most important, and sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. And then it's partially a political process of what companies and advocacy groups what kind of information they are willing to have in public policy and in the hands of government and later on the public. And the dynamics affecting search engine companies like Google and then public companies and or nonprofit entities are much different from that, and we really need to understand how those work as the processes of information and disclosure move outside of the hands of government more toward these third parties. So in the education discussion, you know, we're already seeing a lot of aggregators like greatschools.net or schooldigger.net are a couple of good sites, and that will become more and more common. And so a couple of points on this question. The first is that you might have a couple of models. One is that there's some entity that's more or less of a black box like Google that has an algorithm and produces ratings and search results, and then people either come to trust that or not, and then the people who run the black box will adjust the dials to either satisfy the people who use that search engine or other people who advertise on it or whatever, right? So that's one possible path forward, and certainly there will be a lot of that. Another path forward is more of a wiki model and an open source model or a peer-provided information model in which the business of the search engine or the aggregator is simply to collect a lot of information that thousands or hundreds of thousands of users and clients provide. So right now, greatschools.net, if you look up your kid's grade school on there, you'll have the expert information, that is the test scores and stuff, but then you'll also see a section for parent reviews. And so some people will go to the parent review section and consider that more valuable information than the test score and quote-unquote objective information. But then there's a whole set of questions that arises about how good that peer-provided information is. And we just don't know. So it may be that parents who are particularly kind of mad at their school at some moment will be more likely to write in and provide an opinion than parents who really love it. Or contrary, it might be the case that real boosters of the school will be more likely to write in and post than everybody else. You may get some sampling bias that provides that creates a misimpression, or it may be kind of quite good information that's at a level and kind of granularity that's way deeper than test scores, and it may turn out to be quite good. It's a big question mark as to the dynamics of peer-provided information and how good or bad that is and the conditions under which it gives you a good picture that you ought to rely on. And then the third dimension of John's question is, I think, also a frontier of research. And we need to look a lot more, I think, at how people actually search for information in their day-to-day lives. So, you know, there's some social scientists who give people time diaries to track how they spend their minutes and hours throughout the day. For people interested in search and information, we ought to be doing the same kinds of things. We ought to track how people decide how to go to X or Y doctor, or choose X or Y school, or buy X or Y car, so that we get a real good sense of what people's habits really are like. And, you know, maybe some people really will use Google for the first, you know, search on basically any question they have. Other people will choose quite different methods. But we have to understand that before we can understand how to provide information in a way that is kind of meshes very tightly with the ways that people are accustomed to searching for and using information and basing their choices on it.
Thanks, Archon. We have a question from the great state of Texas about information on pricing, electricity pricing. Electric companies in Texas want demand metering, so a customer can choose their price while consuming electricity in real time. However, the customers have quote-unquote choice in selecting the electric company in the first place, but since deregulation in Texas, the ability for customers to choose the best price has been mixed with the information provided by the electric companies. How should this system evolve given electric choice, price variability that can occur depending upon the time of day? And it's a great question, I think, for a number of reasons. One, because certainly electricity deregulation is something that's happening in more and more states across the country, and secondly, obviously with the ever-increasing prices of energy in general, thinking about price variability is going to become a bigger and bigger public policy issue. I think your question raises two interesting kinds of aspects of the of transparency policy, and they both deal with how we would expect the provision of information on real prices on electricity to affect both the choice of electric providers but also user behavior. If you go back to the action cycle we originally showed up on the screen, the action cycle provides a way of thinking about how information provided to consumers changes the way that people make their decisions. Well, one of the interesting things about real-time information on electricity, and the reason why a lot of, I think, economists look at that as a very important part of policy in the long term, is very few people have any idea that the charge or the cost of using an extra minute of electricity in the midst of the summer during a heat wave, which you would be sympathetic to in Texas, is vastly greater than using that same minute of electricity in a normal period of demand. But because consumers don't see those price differences, there's no way for them to take action. So the first part of our action cycle would say that real price information, particularly if it could be somehow tied into the way people make their electricity decisions, could have a huge impact on the consumption of electricity itself. And in particular, make people aware of the fact that maybe it's not such a great time to turn on that extra appliance in the house in the midst of a summer heat wave, when the cost of doing that is going to be much, much higher than at another time. Up to very recently, there was no time people could have access to that real-time information. The way and it's an interesting way of thinking about transparency, but transparency on the pricing of electricity could have a substantial effect on the way people actually behave in and of itself. The second question you're asking is whether that then translates into shifts in behavior, and in particular, maybe the choice of a different electrical provider, maybe a provider that has lower peak costs because of where they're sourcing their energy or some other thing. I think what's important about your question is that part of the action cycle is completely dependent on the ability of people to make informed choices and to have choices between potential providers, and real choices where one provider might truly be able to give electricity, provide that electricity at a lower cost than another because of, let's say, the use of alternative fuels, alternate sources of energy. So again, the question of choice and the question of the impact of real price information has everything to do with how users make the decisions on one hand, and whether they can translate that information on the true prices of electricity in a real way, and on the other hand, whether that also translates into a change in behavior and the choice of providers, which can then ripple through that action cycle we have on the screen all the way up and change the way disclosers are actually making their decision and compel changes in the way we provide electricity and our use of energy more generally.
Let me try to take one more question from Mary Nix. Mary works in the healthcare area for the federal government. Let's see if I can summarize this. Mary's asking whether in deciding how transparent to be in publishing information on government websites, should we use the user behavior change indicator as a guiding tool. We think it would be hard to do because as a government website, we're limited to the type of information we can collect about and from our users. limited in part by OMB. What lessons can we learn from your work in this regard? Ethical obligations as publishers to be transparent. The Advocacy Center for the Science and Public Interest has expressed specific concern in this way, as have other organizations. Mary, one thing we might do is continue this conversation offline. I'm not dodging the question, but it's interesting and complicated. You can, on our website, transparencypolicy.net, you can get all of our emails, and I and David and I particularly, and Archon as well, are interested in the healthcare area, and we're all headed toward a greater interest in user responses and how, either with government mediation or without government mediation, we can bring users' reactions more clearly into into the system, so that transparency actually produces results. So be in touch with one of us by email, and let's see if we can get more specific about that. But let me conclude, and David and Archon may want to too, just by thanking all of you for joining us, and just to say a word about the future to think about. We're in an extraordinary time where we're seeing in the commercial area on Amazon.com and eBay and lots of other sites that people use, the ability of ordinary people to share their opinions about books, about movies, about products, about professors, about schools. What we have not seen yet, and where we feel that there's tremendous potential, but it's going to take some thinking, and our hope would be to enlist many of you in that thinking, is to think about using that tremendous technological capacity to encourage people to share their opinions about public risks and about government performance in specific ways. You can imagine, for example, in the risk area, people sharing information about a particular safety defect with a particular car model, and therefore not having to wait 5 years for the government to recall, to issue a recall, or perhaps decide not to issue a recall. Comparably, in the side effects of drugs, there isn't any reason why we all can't, in a structured way, share information and therefore keep deaths and injuries from happening that would otherwise happen. In the government performance area, you can imagine people testing water and sharing their opinions about whether there's lead in their particular drinking water, so that patterns emerge, sharing information about infectious disease, so that epidemics or outbreaks that are short of epidemics can be prevented. So just to leave you with that idea, and to guide you, those of you who are interested, to our website, just as a start, it's transparencypolicy.net. You'll find, and it's David's posted it here on your screen. For those of you who have screens, you'll find there summaries of the cases, a good summary of the framework we've developed that we think may be useful as a starting point for many of us in thinking about different kinds of transparency, not just the kind that we specifically look at, which is legislated transparency systems. And it includes a lot of the literature that people have developed looking at particular transparency systems. It also includes our email addresses, and we welcome a chance to be in touch with those of you who are interested in one or another aspect of the subject. So again, thank you for attending, and let me just see if David or Archon wants to say another word.
I would just echo Mary's sentiment that we appreciate the interest of all of you and your excellent questions. I think in preparing for this, we were struck, and in some of your answers to the polling questions, about the diversity of interest in transparency. And Getting back to one of the first things Archon said, transparency does mean so many different things to different people. When you become conscious of the words you start hearing, particularly in a political season as we're in, the use of transparency used reflexively by people for all kinds of things. I think the challenge for all of you out there who are engaged in this issue in various ways, and what we strive to continue to do in the project, is to find meaningful ways to make transparency in those different kinds of ways work more effectively, so that it can be more than just a statement of sort of broad aspiration, but really start to achieve the many goals that the public puts out when they say transparency. So I would echo what Mary said. We really are very interested to know what people in the field are doing. We'd encourage you all to be in touch with us as you develop your own areas of transparency work, whether in the government, business, or academic sectors. And thank you for participating today. Archon?
Yeah, again, I'd just like to thank everyone for participating as well. I was surprised and delighted in particular that there was such a mix of people, not only from government, who, we talked to a lot about this, but also from civil society organizations and then the private sector, because I think for our research, the part of the future of looking at transparency policies is how public information is likely to be produced in the future from a mix of actors in all three kinds of sectors. And then, finally, an apology for people whose questions we didn't get to answer. There are a couple, and we're just kind of out of time now. But again, we encourage people to email us individually and follow up later on. This is still a very live area of interest, and it's a real privilege for us to be kind of following what many of you are doing in your work lives with regard to information and disclosure policy. And then maybe now turn it back to Jim. Jim, do you want to close? Or Jim, are you there?
I think you guys pretty much said it all. My thanks on behalf of the Government Innovators Network for putting such a great event together. And just a reminder to our audience that we will be posting the recording of this on the Government Innovators Network website, and you can also get to it via the Transparency Policy Network website. And or Transparency Policy Project website, and you'll be receiving an email when the recording is posted with instructions on how to find it. And that's all I have. Thanks everybody for attending, and thank you, panel.
Thank you. Thank you.